This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mrs. Irene McSpadden Milam, a niece of Will Rogers. She was interviewed in April of 1971 by Mary Roberts in Chelsea, Oklahoma. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on March 30th, 1990 by Joel Todd.
Mrs. Milam, it's indeed a pleasure to get to interview you, especially for the living legends of our state, because there is certainly no person that could have meant any more to the early history of Methodism as I knew you, and certainly the contributions that you made make you a worthy candidate for this. We would like for you to begin first with your name and your family.
Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. My name, Irene McSpadden Milam, the daughter of John Thomas McSpadden and Sally Rogers. I was born and reared in Chelsea, finished high school there, and then later attended Oklahoma Agricultural College, which is now OSU, and Oklahoma City University. I have a great pride in Chelsea. The town is remarkable in many ways. It was founded perhaps 100 years ago and has always been known as a very cultural spot. It is about equidistant from Claremore, Bonita, Pryor, and Nowata. Those were later county seats when the counties were organized after we became a state. There are three versions as to how the town got its name. One is that it was named by Chelsea's first mayor, who came from Chelsea, Massachusetts. He was an attorney and very public-minded. He made a great contribution to the town in the early days, and it is thought that perhaps he had quite a large part in the naming of it. And then another version is that perhaps the cowboys named it. Of course, the area around Chelsea has always been good grazing ground, and we have always had many, many cattle in that area. The cowboys had a song, Chelsea Town, that they usually bedded the cattle with, don't you know? So some feel.
Do you remember any of the words of that song? You couldn't sing it, but perhaps maybe. But do you remember some of the cowboy songs?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I don't even know whether Herb knows any, Mrs. Roberts, and Herb, I think, knew most of them. That's my brother. So it could have been named by the cowboys. But another version is that it was named by a man named Charlie Peach, who was an employee of our first railroad, the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad, which came through Chelsea in 1883. It had been built to Bonita before that time, but in that year it was extended from Bonita west to the Arkansas River. So you can take your choice now as to how Chelsea got its name. Our first post office was established in November of 1882, even before the railroad came, so we know that we did have a settlement there. Then, by an act of the National Council of the Cherokee Nation, the town was platted and surveyed in 1885, and then in April of 98, it was granted a charter under the Custis Act. The first store in Chelsea was built by Henry Armstrong, a Delaware Indian. He later sold it to W.M. Couch in 1883, and that is known as the first store west of the Frisco tracks. About 2 years later then, he sold it to C.W. Poole and W.J. Strange, and these two men really have been in Chelsea from its very beginning, and they have been very, very influential men and marvelous citizens down through the years. As to churches, it was about the mid-70s when T.K.B. McSpadden, a Methodist minister and a circuit rider with headquarters in Fort Gibson, established a preaching post in the settlement, later to become known as Chelsea. And some years later, when a little brown building was erected, it was called McSpadden Chapel. And Memorial Church in Chelsea is the outgrowth.
That was your grandfather?
My paternal grandfather. However, we had a Sunday school which was organized in 1880. The station agent down at the depot was really instrumental in organizing the first Sunday school. And would you believe that it was organized on the platform of the railroad depot? And later, when no building was adequate for Sunday school, they had Sunday school at 9 o'clock in the waiting room of the Frisco depot.
And the trains didn't bother? They were not sufficient?
Well, I don't think they were running at 9 o'clock in the morning. We were far enough away from St. Louis that our trains usually came along at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, and later Will Rogers said it was the most unearthly hours. Chelsea had the worst hours for trains arriving, so I don't think it bothered the Sunday school. This was, of course, a union Sunday school because there were not enough members of any denomination, for one. But the Methodists couldn't stand it, and about a year later, they organized their own Methodist Sunday school. But the town still wasn't large enough to support two, so most of the members of the Sunday school moved on over with the Methodists. They had only about 30 attending. That was officials and teachers and pupils in that day. But it's interesting to note that some whose names are on the roll of that first Sunday school, the family names are still on the rolls of the churches in Chelsea.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course...
Do you by any chance still have those old records? Do you suppose the church has kept those, or the library?
No. We do have, though, in 98, we had a minister by the name of Vick, Brother J.E. Vick, and I believe it was 96. He published a little booklet, The History of the Church. Now, this was in 96. It gave the history of the Sunday school and of the church, and biographical sketch of many of the men in town. And, of course, he gave, there was a roll of those attending Sunday school, also the church members. There was another list of those contributing, and rather a cute thing, those who paid as much as $5. There was a star opposite their name, but it just those who did not contribute as much as $5, their name was just a blank, and it was rather embarrassing, or perhaps, I don't know, it might be a good thing today.
Get our pledges in.
Yes, to get your pledges. Your pledges were...
But do you suppose that there's any of this, would there be a copy of this anywhere that would be obtainable, do you suppose, for research purposes?
There are two known copies. My sister has one, Helen Eaton.
Oh, Helen.
Helen Eaton has one, and then Jenny Mae Bard at the reporter office has the copy which was owned by this Mr. Peach. So,
who is that? Who has it now?
Peach, Charlie Peach.
And who has it now?
Jenny Mae Bard.
Thank you.
Jenny Mae is quite the historian. Then, as to schools, in those early days, some of the men and women of the town realized that we needed a school, and they got together and built one. The men contributed the money for the building materials, and many of them did the work, and then the woman gave a public entertainment to pay for the furnishings, you know.
Not an ice cream social?
It could have been, but I think this was more of a play. And I mentioned Mr. Strange a bit ago. Now, his wife, Mary, was one of the first teachers in Chelsea. A bit later, the Cherokee Nation established a school there. You know, the Cherokees had a marvelous public school system, but of course that was only for the Indian children. Following the Methodists, though, the Baptists and the Cumberland Presbyterians had good, strong churches in Chelsea. The Methodists happened to be the first, but in '94 then, the Cumberland Presbyterians built a school building which was afterwards known as the Chelsea Academy. And there's where we all got our first training, yes. And about 1900, there were as many as 120 pupils with 4 teachers. This, of course, it was a subscription school. However, many of the townspeople had donated liberally to it, and it gives me pride to know that in 2 places I find that our father was quite a contributor to that school building.
Where his children were educated.
Yes, where his children. Of course, after the territory became a state then, and we established the public school system, the academy was finally taken over, bought by the state and used. And our public school now in Chelsea, the grade school, is built on the site of the old Chelsea Academy. So that is of interest. And then Chelsea was a very thriving and prosperous community. And in 1896, we had the first state bank, the Bank of Chelsea, and that bank is still in operation. So, yes, continuously. The Bank of Chelsea, since it's the oldest state bank, and then the first national bank was organized in 1901. But one of the things which I remember with so much pleasure, Mrs. Roberts, is our fair. Chelsea had a wonderful fair, and it was organized in 1900. And my sister also has a...
Maybe that's where your famous uncle got his version from that fair, because I thought his picture was perfect.
Wasn't it?
It was.
Well,
that must have been some of his
oh, yes. Well, he attended. Oh, of course, it was a big event in the year, you know, the fair. And why, we would ask the relatives for miles around, you know, to come. And oftentimes, even the relatives from Claremore would have to spend the night and all. We didn't have the means of communication we have now. But
and distances were longer.
Oh, yes. I remember Helen has a catalog from 1904 and also 1913. She may have some in between.
Now, Helen is...
Eaton. Helen Eaton.
Your sister.
Yes, at Chelsea. Now, let's see. The admittance was 25 cents, a season ticket for $1.25. And then they had wonderful exhibits. Of course, in the women's department, we have all kinds of handwork. And then foods. The canned foods were just pictures. And then in the baking, the cookies and the cakes and the pies. And then the men, of course, exhibited their stock. But, the horse races that we had. Hot Springs had nothing on Chelsea in the early days. And really...
Just right out on the prairie.
Oh, yes. Well, it was over in the northeastern part of town, and it was in a blackjack area, so we did have shade for the stock, you know. But, it was really a very, very good fair. It was rated so. And in years later, when I attended the Dallas State Fair, which I think is just supreme, it didn't bring me any more joy than the remembrance of my childhood experiences at our fair. And then another thing which I remember and was indicative of the town's culture was that we had the Red Path Horner Circuit every summer. And we had marvelous programs. And, of course, that was long.
Was that something like the Chautauqua?
It was.
Was
It
it
was a
Chautauqua?
Chautauqua, the Red Path Hornet Chautauqua.
Mm-hmm.
And it brought in such wonderful talent. Nowadays, of course, we can flip on radio and television, you know. But in those days, we had neither. And to think that, William Jennings Bryan, or I heard my first Hawaiian music, don't you know, on the old. And again, we sent out the call for the relatives to come in. And we didn't.
Special time.
Oh, it was a gala event. And, you know, we didn't seem to mind the heat.
Go ahead. Let me get this. Go ahead and speak.
I think perhaps you'd be interested in some of our fellow townsmen. The most colorful man, I think, was A.J. Blackwell. And he became put out. He had some kind of enmity toward the fellow townsmen. So he moved south of Chelsea, 3/4 of a mile, and established a new town, the city of David. And at one time, it had 100 people there. It was quite a thriving little place. And then later, he had intermarried into the Cherokee tribe and was a citizen. But an individual was not allowed to sell Indian lands, you know, until after the government made the allotment.
Mm-hmm.
So he was prosecuted and convicted of selling lands. So that had, of course, the town then came to a standstill.
Mm-hmm.
And shortly afterwards, a cyclone blew most of it away. And that which remained finally just disintegrated. And people moved away.
Ghost town.
But Mr. Blackwell went on to found the town of Blackwell. But he had, oh yes, but he had his beginnings in Chelsea. Another interesting fact, I think, Mrs. Roberts, is that just after we became a state and was divided into a county, we had very, very fine people in Chelsea, able, capable people. And for that first election, Chelsea elected nearly all of the major officers of the county. Well, Claremore woke up, and after that year, it was 20 years before Chelsea elected another major official.
Was Claremore larger at that time?
Oh yes, and of course it had been the county seat.
Mm-hmm.
And but that was the end of Chelsea. Now then, there are many family names. You want to cut that?
I can hear the rest.
Yes. All right. During our fair too, Grandpa Rogers had a very fine trotting horse, which he called Roger K. And he would bring Roger K. up and enter him in the races. But later, it was a great joy for us grandchildren when he would take one of us or several of us for a ride behind Roger K. He had a little one-seat, what would you call it?
I don't
Well, runabout. I believe it was a runabout with red wheels. And Roger K. was always beautifully groomed, you know. And we would just go stepping behind Roger K. Really, a Rolls Royce meant no more to us than behind that horse. I just adored my grandfather. He was truly a wonderful man. He was very prominent in tribal affairs. And of course, he had been a captain, understand weighty, when that Union supply train was captured up at Pensacola. And that, I think, is considered to be one of the biggest victories that the South had in Oklahoma. And Grandpa Rogers was a member of that, that captured that train. I think the train was valued at about $1 million. But Grandpa would never talk of his experiences in the war. He'd say, no, that is finished. But he was truly a wonderful person. He was very, very civic-minded. And he always backed up his interest with his purse, you know. And then he was so wonderful to the grandchildren. We had not known our grandmother. She had passed away before we came into the world. But Grandpa was always entertaining us and doing things for our pleasure. And when we had the field meets in Claremore, of course, Claremore was the county seat. We had to come to Claremore for everything. And we would come down on the train, on the Frisco train. It was quite an event to ride that 18 miles, on the train. But Grandpa would meet us. He would hire a hack and take us with our Chelsea friends out to the fairgrounds, for the field meet. And as I say, as dearly as I loved and am proud of Uncle Will, I am quite as proud of the heritage I have, which was given me by my grandfather, because, as I say, Uncle Will, to my mind, is just a later edition of my grandfather. He was truly a great man.
Mm-hmm.
What else? I mentioned the fact that Grandpa Rogers was always entertaining us in Claremore. Uncle Will did likewise when he was in one of the cities neighboring, close enough to us. In the early days, he was on the Keith Orpheum circuit.
Mm-hmm.
And every time he came to either St. Louis or Kansas City, he would write for several of us, usually 4, to come and be his guest. I remember one year, my sister and 2 cousins and I went to Kansas City when he was appearing there. Blanche Ring, quite an actress in her day, was appearing there in some play. At the moment, I don't remember what. And Uncle Will had told her that his family was coming, and so she sent tickets for her show. Well, we had been so intrigued with the shops that we were a bit late in arriving. It was a matinee, however. And we were a bit embarrassed, fearing that she had come on the stage before we got there. And we were not watching the usher. Of course, the lights had been dimmed. But we were looking toward the stage, and I was leading the procession. And I failed to note that there was a flight of stairs. So I took them head first. And but we were fortunate in that Miss Ring had not appeared yet. When we got to our seats, we found that it was a front box. And later, when she came on, she played to us that afternoon. And, of course, we were just on cloud 9.
Yeah.
But I'll have to admit, I stole the show first.
I have wanted to go back just a little bit to your mother, if we may. My one or two contacts that I had with her, I remember her as one of the most magnetic characters that I have ever known anywhere. Tell me a little bit more about her.
Uncle Will was immeasurably proud of her, too, Mrs. Roberts.
Yes.
And you see, she was much older. His own mother had passed away when he was about 10, perhaps 8 or 10. And I think Mother played a dual role where he was concerned. She was not only the sister, but he looked to more in the position as mother. And even until the very last, he was very, very solicitous of her, but he wanted her opinion. He valued her opinion most highly. And even he would call her long distance. And so she was. We used to laugh at Mother. She had a marvelous physical stamina. That was, I think, inherited from her pioneer parents. And we used to laugh at Mother and say the farther she went, the better she felt, And like Uncle Will, she could manage on just a few hours' sleep and be up and running and just as alert. And people stimulated Mother.
Yes.
So, they did.
She loved people.
Oh, she loved people. And she was usually leading the parade, too, So,
She was a leader in the women's work of our church. When my first contact with her was at a district meeting of the Women's Society. And then I don't remember seeing her again for perhaps 2 years. But I had not forgotten the magnetic personality of your mother. I'm sure she was the same with any enterprise that was started. The schools must have had her right behind them.
oh, indeed, she was. She was so alive. She was so interested in everything. And as I say, she had a marvelous vitality. And that was the days before Geritol, too, you know. She didn't have to have Geritol to get her started. She was up early, and she wanted everybody else up early. We grew up in the days when everybody had to be at the breakfast table.
That's right, so was I.
Mm-hmm. Another thing which, well, both of my parents were deeply devout. But when we were growing up, we had Bible verses at the breakfast table. And one very happy recollection of my childhood was that we were such a close family. Aunt Maud, my mother's younger sister, lived in Chelsea, and the two families were reared almost as one. And our Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays were spent together. And even though we were in this small town, we moved physically over to the other home for 2 nights. For instance, at Thanksgiving time, we would, perhaps Aunt Maud would be having the Thanksgiving celebration. We would go the evening before, and here would be the long table. Mother and Aunt Maud both had any number of 5-yard claws, you know, dinner claws. At the table, beautifully set, and we had a wonderful meal that evening with everybody present. The next morning, everybody was down for breakfast. If it was Thanksgiving, everyone had to have a Thanksgiving verse, and you could not repeat a verse. So we knew much more of the Bible in those days, I think, than we know now.
Somebody got your verse first, you had to have another.
You had to have another. You had to be prepared. Then would come the big Thanksgiving dinner, and perhaps just more of a buffet supper. And then the next morning, here was another big breakfast, and then we would go home. Then at Christmas time, they would come to us. And Christmas Eve, we would have the big dinner, and usually my father would butcher a beef and several hogs, you know. So here was the tenderloin of trout and the beef tenderloin, or sometimes steaks and rib. And then some of us...
It makes our mouth water.
And some of us even liked the fried pig's feet in batter for breakfast. You know, I can remember that. Oh, yes. Oh, we had bountiful meals. But now I say they were coming to us for Christmas time. Then after our big dinner on Christmas Eve, we would go to the church for the tree. Then we would come back and have our own tree. And Mother and Aunt Maud both had libraries with closing doors, and we were not permitted to see the tree until we had come from the church. And Aunt Maud or Mother would, which one, would take their gifts over and get the tree all arranged. Of course, Grandpa Rogers was there. He came from Claremore for that event always. And then in between times, he came every weekend, Mrs. Roberts. He would come up to Chelsea, and we had a train coming at 5 o'clock. And he would go to and he would go to Aunt Maud's and spend Saturday night and Sunday, attend church and have dinner and his nap. But when he awakened from his nap, we had to be there to bring Grandpa over home. And then there was a train coming back to Claremore at noon on Monday. And my mother had an old Negro cook, Bertha, for years and years. Well, I think the train came about 12:30, but Grandpa wanted dinner about 11 o'clock. And if Bertha wasn't stirring herself, he'd come in and she said, Sally, get that cook busy now. He said, you know, the train may come in ahead of time. So, and we're all very much like that.
Go ahead.
I think I didn't finish about our Christmas. We went to the tree, and then, of course, Christmas morning, it was a Christmas verse we had to have.
Oh, yeah.
A Christmas verse. Oh, yes. Oh, we always Growing up, we always had Bible verses every day, but for these special occasions, of course, there were Thanksgiving and Christmas verses, and then the big dinner, and then, of course, Christmas night, of course, they stayed. And it was funny, after we girls began to grow up and receive flowers from our boy friends, we would take the old pictures the vases gave out, because in those days, the boys really sent roses, long roses. Mine were the pink, yes. And I remember Estelle had dark red when she had to take the umbrella vase one at a time. But the house was just filled with flowers, and you see, there were about 5 of us girls receiving flowers. And it was funny, there was only one little nigger boy in town. He was a janitor at the bank. And the boys would take turnabout using Buck, and they would never permit him but take just one bouquet at a time. So he would have to make about 5 trips to finish up his delivery on the flowers. But really, we had a truly wonderful.
Well, was there a florist in Tulsa? I mean, in Chelsea?
Oh no,
where?
no.
They were ordered out of.
They were ordered out.
Of Tulsa.
I would like to give you some of the names that have made Chelsea history.
Good.
Mrs. Roberts.
They were ordered out of.
They were ordered out.
Of Tulsa.
I would like to give you some of the names that have made Chelsea history.
Good.
Mrs. Roberts. We have the McSpaddens and Pools, Milam, McIntosh, Love.
Now, this Mr. Milam, that's,
my husband's father.
yes. Thereby hangs a tale. I wonder how far I dare delve into the romance between a certain Miss Irene and Mr. Walter McSpadden Milam.
Well, that was a war wedding, you know. We'll have to take another chapter for that, because we had been engaged for some time. Walker was attending Oklahoma University, and I was over at Stillwater. And we decided to be married. Well, the World War I came along, you know, and he wanted to enlist. So we left school and went home. And then after he did enlist, we were uncertain as to whether to be married or not. One day, we would think that we would be married. The next day, we would wait until after the war was over. And Uncle Will gave to each of us a barrel of china. I think my own, of Haviland. I think I had 250 pieces. Mine came from Wanamaker's in Philadelphia. So my china came, and we unpacked it, and at that stage of the game, we were going to wait until after the war was over. But we unpacked it to check it for breakage, and there was not a piece broken. And we repacked it to wait until after the war. Well, Walker kept going to Tulsa. He had enlisted in this Tulsa Ambulance Company, which was the first one of the first recruited in Oklahoma. It was made up largely of University of Tulsa boys. That was old Kendall College. And one Saturday night, he had been to Tulsa, and they thought they would be called out on Monday. So he came out home, and he said, well, we're going to be married tonight. It's now or nothing. And at the time, aside from everything from our Chautauqua circuit and the fair and everything, we always had a big tent meeting, you know, revival meeting. Well, one of those was in progress downtown, and both families were were there. So Walker then, of course, had to come to, we finally decided we would be married on Saturday night. He was to be called out Monday morning, you know. So Walker had to come to Claremore for the license, and I took our car and rounded up the family. Of course, I had to get them out of the tent meeting, and my father was hard of hearing, and he couldn't understand what it was all about. And in coming to Claremore, we had Hiram Stevens, the first sheriff, elected from Chelsea was still sheriff. And Walker came at such a speed, he thought that he was one of the bootleggers he had been looking for, so he apprehended him. And Walker finally identified himself and told him he was really coming after a marriage license. So Mr. Stevens let him go. Well, the family finally gathered, and our minister was a man named Rogers. He was elderly. And really, the things were happening so fast that he became quite confused. But in getting the Milam and McSpadden families together, that was quite a chore, and we had a goodly number. We had a hedge of annual roses from the kitchen door out to the garden, and to show you how resourceful my mother was, as a brother and cousin of Walker's came in, she gave them scissors, and they went and cut roses, and by the time I was dressed and all, everything was arranged. In the meantime, yes, we had a Fort Worth dressmaker, and our clothes had been ordered. I mean, my clothes had been ordered. But
you knew it would be soon.
Yes, but we had packed away the clothes, you know, as I say. 1 week we would be married, and the next week we wouldn't. And in one of the weeks where we were supposed to be, then the clothes had been ordered and all. So, and that morning, on Saturday morning, Mother always baked a caramel cake made with the 3 cups of sugar. Now, this was just the icing, you know. 3 cups of sugar and a cup of butter and a cup of milk. Now, that was the icing. Well, I think Mother had 2 of those that morning. So we even had cake that night. And Helen had finished high school the night before, and Walker had sent her flowers. So my bride's bouquet was made. Well, you should read the write-up of the wedding. I have it. Admittedly full of. Wrote it up. Oh, and then Walker stood at the door, and 2 of his cousins always carried quite a bankroll, and he relieved them of the money. And so we went to Kansas City at 12:30. We were on the train for Kansas City with the money, you know, from Walker's 2 cousins. And when we did return home, the company wouldn't be called out until September, so we had plenty of time. But it's a wedding that wasn't duplicated.
No.
Even for in wartime.
I would love to see that write-up.
Oh, I have it. And my grandchildren, my granddaughters, just, they can't believe it, you know, of grandmother, the way grandmother was married and all.
From this union, there was one son.
One
right?
son. Yes.
Can you tell us something of him? And
during the war, he was with Boeing. He finished at OU in 41.
now that's World War
II. World War II.
That he was in.
And he was with Boeing. He finished with a degree in mechanical engineering with aeronautical preference. And he went to Boeing, and he was not in uniform, but he was with Boeing and finished as the test pilot on the B-29. So he's in the air. He now has 8 children, and they are so interesting, and each of the 8 is different in temperaments, appearance, and everything.
Whom did he marry?
He married Betty Skogsberg from Oklahoma City. She was born in Wichita. And so I now have 2 great-grandchildren, Mrs. Roberts, and I'm just back from having spent several weeks with Sally Ann, who lives in Oklahoma City, and little Lyra, 17 months old.
Oh, how sweet.
And so when I returned home, someone asked me how I kept my figure, and I said, by keeping up with Lyra, 17 months.
Well, the son that, you remember I went off the conference board to go to work.
Yes.
I was putting a boy through medical school.
Yes.
That boy is a surgeon now in Enid. But I was thinking your boy and mine were about the same age.
Well,
but yours is a little older, I guess.
Tom was born in 1918.
Well, no, he's older. He's a little bit older than son. Son is 40 now.
Well, see, and Tom's 52.
And we have 3 grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren. Rusty, we call him.
Yes.
Because his name is really Clarence R. the Third.
Uh-huh.
So he had copper-colored hair, and the nurses named him Rusty, and it stayed with him.
Yes.
So it's Rusty. And then Sarah Lynn, the darling little girl, big dimples and big round blue eyes, and like my husband had. And then the baby, who was born 7 years after Lynn, is Suzanne, and she will soon be 3.
Oh.
And of course, with so many tutors among the older children in the family,
Yes.
you'd never know what to expect from Suzanne. I imagine she's very much like the one that you've been chasing to keep your figure.
Oh, let's see. I'd like to give you.
I have one more question.
Oh, yes, Miss.
I'd like for you to give us just a little bit more about your term of service as the president of our Methodist Women's Society. I can remember some of the things. I can remember you on the platform. I didn't get to attend very many because I was working at the library at the time and then later at the hospital. And I didn't get to attend very many of the meetings during your term of office, but I did keep up with you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Roberts. I had been in West Oklahoma City, which was considered West Oklahoma Conference. And then in the fall, in September of 1940, when my mother was ill and my husband was in Illinois anyway, working, I came back to be with Mother. And she passed away then in 43. Well, in the spring of 44, I had a call from Muskogee. Now, mind you, I had been away, for a number of years.
Yes, I remember.
But our conference was meeting in Muskogee, and I was asked if I would permit my name to go for the president of the conference. And I
was
told...
that the joints in the east and the west?
No, it
the
was just the East Oklahoma Conference.
Oklahoma.
East Oklahoma Conference.
That's right. you
And I
were
told Mrs. Brown definitely not, that I had been away too long. In the meantime, we had gone through unification, don't you know, with the North and South. But this was in 44, but this was the east half of the state. And I told her, no, I was out of the work. The 3 years I had been in my mother's home, I had not attended any meetings, and of course, those were in the early days of unification, and I wouldn't consider it. And Walker had come home early to lunch, and he could hear my end of the conversation. He said, what was that all about? And I said, well, Mrs. Brown from Muskogee is calling, and they want my name to go up for president of the conference. Well, he said, why don't you consider it? And I said, well, first, I'm not capable. Oh, he said, I think you are. And then I said, there are other things to be considered. I said, now, if I take this, it comes first, regardless of what happens at home. This comes first. And then I said it would require quite a bit of money. I'm taking too long.
No, you're
all right. Well, we talked at some time, and he said, you call them back and tell them you'll take it. And I called Mrs. Brown. It was about 45 minutes later. And she said, Mrs. Milam, our committee has been in prayer ever since we called you. I think that's one of those concrete examples of prayer. I did take it, and there were 4 of the most wonderful years of my life, Ms. Roberts. I enjoyed every minute of it.
You were such an inspiration to all of us.
Well, it was during war years, you know, and we only had an A gasoline card, which meant that I used the bus. So I became thoroughly familiar with the bus services, you know, and learned to like them. I also learned to relax. The minute I got on a bus, I relaxed.
We rode down to Oklahoma City together one evening when I was teaching here, and I rode back down there. You were on the bus that evening.
But I believe, looking back, I believe the thing which we accomplished during the 4 years that I did serve as president was the establishment of our School of Missions over at Camp Egan. It did something for us, yes. The Egans had given this a camp, and our women came. We have had young mothers from Tulsa come with 3 preschool children. One feature of our camp which we liked was that we took care of the children during class hours. And Mr. Egan, who had given the camp, liked that plan very much. And some of the women now who are working in the Women's Society were those babies who were in our nursery.
Another thing that I think benefited there was that it brought so many of the Indians into our work. Do you remember the first that came from eastern Oklahoma?
Yes, they did.
And
but there was a bond among our women. We were taken away from our workaday world, away from radio or away from newspaper. We were just in a world of our own.
That's right.
And it was truly a mountaintop experience. And those women who went through those days together have never forgotten it, and it did something to them. And just last week at our state assembly of Daughters of American Colonists, one woman from Ponca came up and said, "Ms. Milam, I haven't seen you since Camp Egan." But in our work, it solidified our work. We had a marvelous training program.
How long after that was it before the East and the West joined?
I think it was about 6 years, maybe 4.
Time gets away. I didn't think it'd been that
48,
long.
52. It was in the early 50s.
Under Mary Metzger?
No, Mrs. Chickasha went in as president. Miss Ford. It was under Miss Ford.
That's right. Well, this has been a most pleasant interview. Do you think of something else now that you would like to add?
I haven't finished my families.
Oh, that's right. The famous families are the best-known ones from Chelsea, and we're getting a list about them.
I think I mentioned Love, Couch, Strange, Parks, South, Morrison, Tibbs.
Yeah. Morrison, we begin there. You didn't mention that before.
All right. Dixon, Pennington, Bird, Buffington, Kell, Hester, Henry, Delozier, Culp, Hogue, and Sharp. And many of those
are those still there?
Families,
their families
many, yes, have lived and died there, and then their children, these are the descendants, still there.
Those names are still known
those names.
You'd find them in the telephone directory.
Definitely. Yes.
Well, this has been a most pleasant thing. I've enjoyed so much your stories of your family and your people and the wonderful relationships that you had with so many of those early day people. Thank you so much, Ms. Milam.
We make one correction on the preceding tape, and that is that Mrs. Ford is from Lawton rather than Chickasha.